My name is Charlotte Phillips. I'm the chairperson of Brooklyn for Peace, and thank you all very much for coming tonight. We're very happy to have this program tonight, and very thankful to our guest speakers for coming, Dr. Bereket Selassie from North Carolina and Mr. Milton Allimadi from New York City. So in case you're not familiar with Brooklyn for Peace, please take one of our brochures from the table out front and consider joining to become a member. We're a multi-issue peace and justice organization. We've been working in Brooklyn since 1984, and our core mission is prevention of war. So you can see we have a long way still to go, but everyone's participation is important, and we approach it from many different angles. We're non-sectarian, non-partisan. We're an educational organization, but we see activism as being a very important part of our work. So we encourage everybody to become informed as possible and then to become active, which is the reason for this program tonight on the crisis in South Sudan, which is a horrendous crisis and which has not been receiving as much attention as other crises in other areas of the world. So we're very happy that Dr. Mohammed Nurhussein, who's my fellow board member on the Brooklyn for Peace board, and also the chairperson of the United African Congress, was able to prepare this program tonight. I'm going to turn the program over to him to introduce the topic and also to introduce the speakers. But we'll have a question and answer session following the presentation, so please feel free to ask questions, and we hope for an important discussion afterwards as well. Again, thanks so much for coming. Mohammed?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. My name is Mohammed Nurhussein. I'm, as Charlotte said, a board member of the Brooklyn for Peace, and also chairman of United African Congress, one of the sponsors of this event. My duty here is really to introduce you to the speakers. But before that, I think the crisis in South Sudan has been festering so long without the kind of attention that it should get. In fact, all the focus has been on Syria, as it should be, but South Sudan is no less a catastrophic event taking place for so many years or for a long time. And from 2013 to 2015, something like 1,890,000. By now, they probably are 2 million refugees, have been refugees. And Uganda alone has close to 900,000 of them. There are some 400,000 in Ethiopia and another 400,000 in Sudan, all living in squalor, in camps that are not really fit for proper habitation, cholera outbreaks and malnutrition. In addition to all of that, there have been 2 to 3 million people who have died of starvation, basically, over the years. And so this is a humanitarian catastrophe that's unfolding, not to mention the conflict that has been between the president and the vice president and their forces, which are increasingly taking the appearance of some kind of ethnic directed attacks. And like one of the speakers earlier wrote in a paper in Daily News, this is a genocide in the making, unless some intervention takes place. So with that said, I would like to introduce the speaker now. What we're going to do is Milton would come on here and give us an overview, and Professor Selassie will follow. Milton Allimadi is the founder and publisher of Black Star News. He is also adjunct professor at the John Jay College. He is a human rights activist and has been bringing to the world's attention the goings on and the actors in this catastrophe who are making this to continue. So he will tell us more about that. Professor Selassie is the Leuchtenburg Distinguished Professor of Law, Law, and also Professor of African Studies. He's got actually a long list of accomplishments in his lifetime, but I would rather not dwell on that now. I will tell you more about it when he's about to speak. So to start off the program, to give us an overview of the situation in South Sudan, I call on my friend Milton Allimadi.
Greetings, sisters and brothers. Thank you for coming. I thank Charlotte and the organization for hosting this very critical and important event. I thank the United African Congress for co-hosting, and Give a Hand Foundation. I suspect the reason why most of you are here today is because when you see the conflict, not only in South Sudan, but in other countries, whether it's an African country, whether it's Syria, and you see the humanitarian catastrophe, and you probably wonder, what can I do as an individual? Because sometimes these conflicts look like they're spontaneous, like they're always happening, so you're confused. Can it really end? Can we really do something effectively about it? So I'm here tonight with reference to South Sudan to say that yes, indeed, we can play a critical role, because in South Sudan, as well as in many African countries, the United States is a big player. The United States exerts considerable influence. In fact, I would say the predominant influence, particularly in South Sudan. The United States is the primary sponsor of the Ugandan government. Uganda receives about $750 million a year in US taxpayer support, and about $170 million of that goes to the military. So why am I starting with Uganda and not South Sudan? Because Uganda is the major player in South Sudan, has been the major player for many years now. And without dealing with Uganda's undue and negative and destructive influence in what is going on in South Sudan, we will not be able to resolve this problem. So this means we have to address the US support for Uganda. Only the US really can rein in the Ugandan regime and get it to change its destructive course in South Sudan. So let me give you some very brief background. South Sudan won its independence in 2011. It had been engaged in many decades of warfare against the central government in Khartoum, a central government which did not have much positive contribution toward the southern part of the country. And that's why the South felt the urge to break away from the rest of Sudan. Ultimately, a deal was negotiated and South Sudan became an independent nation in 2011. And Salva Kiir became president and Riek Machar became vice president. And they had led for many decades different units which ultimately had merged as the Sudanese People's Liberation Movement and Liberation Army, SPLMA/A. Then in 2013, a political crisis emerged between Salva Kiir and Riek Machar. And most of the regional African countries became involved in trying to resolve the situation. They wanted to mediate between the two when hostilities broke out in December 2013. So Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and several countries, Sudan, became involved in negotiating a solution. But while Uganda was officially part of the mediators, Yoweri Museveni, the ruler of Uganda, for the last 31 years now, was playing a very destructive role. He actually sent his army into South Sudan to support one side in this conflict, which was President Salva Kiir's side. So this exacerbated the situation. Rather than a political crisis, now we have a full-fledged civil war with atrocities being committed by the government army, as well as the armed supporters of Riek Machar, who himself was driven out of the country into exile. So, but a lot of pressure came to bear on both Salva Kiir and Riek Machar because of the humanitarian catastrophe that was being created by this conflict. So ultimately, a deal was arrived at, a peace agreement was signed. Salva Kiir signed very reluctantly, but he signed nonetheless. In fact, the U.S. is on the record as saying he would be sanctioned personally if he did not sign the deal to end the conflict. So he put certain conditions that he added unilaterally as an addendum before he signed. But he signed ultimately anyway in August 2015, and the same government was put back together. So Riek Machar came back from exile and became the first vice president with Salva Kiir as president. This arrangement, the Transitional Government of National Unity, lasted only until last year in July. Once again, Salva Kiir attacked his vice president's resident and forces, and again drove him out of the country. And that is how we arrived at the calamity that we now face in South Sudan. And I believe Salva Kiir attacked because he knew that he could always rely on the military support of Uganda. Museveni would prefer to have Salva Kiir as the only person in charge of South Sudan. He feels he can control Salva Kiir. And that is the problem. So now the United Nations appointed a group of experts to study the situation, and they delivered a report to the Security Council in April. And in this report, it makes clear Uganda's negative role in this conflict. It also blames Salva Kiir for being primarily responsible for the escalation beginning in July 2016. and it describes some of the most unimaginable atrocities that are being carried out against unarmed civilians, against women, against children. And some of it, I'm sure you've read in articles in the New York Times, where even children have been dismembered and thrown in the rivers. How do you do this to other human beings? And that is how the refugee crisis has been created. Now we have 800,000 in Uganda, maybe about 2 million displaced domestically, and 60% of these are children. The report also makes it clear that there's only a political solution to this conflict, even though it makes clear that Salva Kiir is still trying to pursue a military solution. The report also makes clear that there cannot be a solution without bringing Riek Machar back into the equation. So obviously you start thinking of what are some possible viable solutions. That's why, if some of you saw the article that I wrote in the Daily News, the New York Daily News, the op-ed, my proposal was that perhaps both Salva Kiir and Riek Machar should have their forces disarmed and bring a truly neutral international force to provide security in the country and to act as the police force, and to also protect the country from Uganda, to make sure that Uganda's army would no longer be able to influence events in Southern Sudan, while at the same time you're providing security for the South Sudanese. You're bringing a force that has no incentive to commit atrocities against the people of South Sudan, and that is why I made that suggestion in the op-ed I wrote in the Daily News. Let me just highlight a few more points, and then I will save the rest for when we get to the Q&A. So the question that you may be asking yourself, why is Uganda playing such a destructive role in South Sudan? A number of reasons. Number one, the Ugandan dictator has been in power for 31 years. How has he been able to accomplish that? With US support. As I mentioned earlier, the United States provides Uganda with $750 million. The United States trains Uganda's army. The United States has a base, a military base in Uganda as we speak. That is how he's been able to survive for such a long time. And what does he do in return for the United States? He serves as the regional policeman. Just like Mobutu, the dictator of Zaire, which is now Democratic Republic of Congo, used to do in the 60s and 70s, a reliable US agent in the region. So for example, when the US wanted African troops to be based in war-torn Somalia to try to prevent Al-Shabaab from taking over the government there, Uganda was very happy to provide 10,000 soldiers, which it did. So in return, General Museveni gets a blank check. So what incentive does he have in crises in South Sudan? By creating turmoil in other countries, it deflects from his own repression within Uganda. So right now, even though there's a lot of political repression, suppression in Uganda, when compared to South Sudan, you know, Uganda would appear almost like paradise. And he does that deliberately. This is not the first time. He's done it with neighboring Democratic Republic of the Congo, were invaded in 1997. That led to atrocities, multiple wars, and the Congo has lost an estimated anywhere from 6 to 10 million people as a result. And that was due to Uganda's invasion. So he creates regional turmoil to divert attention from his own domestic repression. But then there's a second critical issue which has emerged in South Sudan. South Sudan has oil. South Sudan has oil. And that, I believe, is now playing a role as well in the crisis. There's been media reports that there's some shady companies based in Uganda, based in Kenya, and some based in Ethiopia that are brokering oil deals with Salva Kiir. And obviously Salva Kiir is desperate for financing to buy arms, so he's signing these oil deals. One reported deal was signed with a company called Oranto, which is supposedly owned by a Nigerian. And I say supposedly owned because a few years ago, Oranto signed an oil deal in Liberia, but then within a very short time, sold that concession to Chevron. Now, recently, Oranto signed a deal, reportedly with Salva Kiir. Oranto promised $500 million. I don't know if that money was paid or not. But Oranto does not have the capacity to exploit oil. So I will not be surprised if Oranto's intention is to sell that concession to another company. Might it be Chevron? Might it be another US company? Might it be other major oil company? Who knows? But that's the recent development. So now the question emerges, are oil interests also escalating and perpetrating this war by supporting Salva Kiir, thinking they can do business deals with him, even though they know quite clearly well, as the UN said, without bringing Riek Machar back into the equation, this conflict is just going to continue. And of course, the biggest victims, as we are aware, are the civilians, the women, the children, and the elderly. Thank you, sisters and brothers.
Thank you. Thank you, Milton. I think we probably will do better to go with the next speaker and hold the questions towards the end. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. I would like now to introduce you Dr. Bereket H. Selassie. I know him for a long time. He has served as the youngest Attorney General in Ethiopia way back when. You can imagine. I think in the 50s or 60s or something. 60s. And he's been he served the Ethiopian government in various capacities. Then he ran afoul of the system there and left the country. He worked at the World Bank here for a while, and he was called on by the when the revolution broke out in Ethiopia. He was called back home to help, with the new country developing its constitution and so on. But again, that revolution eventually turned sour. The military took over, and he had to run for his life. He's always been active for the Eritreans' right for self-determination, and he went to Eritrea and brokered peace between the two fighting factions of the Eritrean Liberation Movement. But eventually, and then he was called to write the constitution of the new nation after it became independent. He did write that constitution, but the current dictator shelved the constitution aside, and his life was threatened. He had to leave the country, and the last several years now he's been professor at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And so, without further ado, I mean, there's a lot you can say about him, but let's stop at that. He will probably tell us a little bit about the constitutional development, the Constitution of South Sudan, and perhaps whatever else he wants to add on that. Okay.
Thank you, Mohammed. I heard about this event late, really late, and I was tempted to come, and so I proposed myself, which is rather interesting, to come here. It is not characteristic of modest professor to propose himself to become part of an event. But I've never been modest about my skills. And my friend happens to be somebody who knew me. But anyway, I couldn't resist taking part in this wonderful event. But I'm rather in the supporting cast because Professor Milton Allimadi has an excellent summary of the problem, the cause of the current crisis in South Sudan. I thought maybe what I could do is to give you a sort of short narrative of what might have been a wonderful part of Africa. I have been privileged to have been asked to be part of an expert group in writing constitutions of several countries in Africa, including South Sudan, Nigeria, and other countries. It has been one of my most rewarding experiences in being part of the constitution-making process of these new countries. And I was overjoyed when I was asked by people who knew me, having been interested in the history of Sudan, including the South Sudan Liberation Movement. Even as I supported the Eritrean Liberation Movement, we used to have meetings with the leaders of the South, including the late John Garang, whom I met a couple of times while he was lobbying here in Washington. I've never met Salva Kiir, but the kind of story we heard about Salva Kiir's tendency to want to dominate and to eliminate the rival is typical of dictators in Africa, including the one who happens to be ruling my own homeland, Eritrea. I'm not surprised that Museveni tried to become the regional hegemon of that area, because President Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea tried to become the regional hegemon of the whole of Africa, which is why we had a war between Eritrea and Ethiopia in 1998. People who know the history of Eritrea and Ethiopia, I'm sure understand the story why there was a war between 1998 and 2000, which was started by an attack committed by the Eritrean army on the region of Ethiopia called Badime. So that war is called the Badime War, started by Eritrea, which I stated at that time, even though many Eritreans opposed me for saying that. But my devotion to truth, telling to power, was confirmed by the decision of the United Nations Commission that was asked to mediate between Eritrea and Ethiopia. They declared Eritrea the guilty party in terms of starting the war, even though finally they awarded the cause of the war, the casus belli, Badime, which was taken by Ethiopia. They awarded that to Eritrea, so that's the only part in which Eritrea could be said to have won the case. Now, the reason why Eritrea started the war by the decision of the dictator without consulting his colleagues, without consulting the parliament, even though it's a rubber stamp parliament, there was a parliament. One would think that in a decision which involves taking people to war, which involves blood and treasure of a nation, one would think that it would be very natural for the president to consult, at least consult the parliament. He did not. He simply went to war, sent his army to Ethiopia. And the analysis of the Ethiopian people at the time, the leader, the late Meles Zenawi, who characterized Isaiah's characteristic as Bonapartist, which is a take from Napoleon Bonaparte, or Bonaparte, the Italians would say, that this Bonapartist tendency was the reason why the Eritrean leader took us to war. He had tried, in fact, as far as going beyond Uganda and Rwanda, and using Rwanda as a base of operation. He even tried to influence as far as Congo Zaire at the time. But then they joined hands with Meles and helped in the overthrow of Mobutu. At that time, at least, they were on speaking terms. But then I think Meles saw the ambition of Isaias as a real ambitious potential hegemon of the area, which includes Ethiopia, who wanted to be the power, decide things, Ethiopia and beyond. And that is the real reason why we went to war in 1998. So I was surprised when I heard Milton talking about Museveni's, wearing Museveni's design on South Sudan, which is tragic because I was part of the expert committee, which helped in drafting the constitution of South Sudan. And after that, I was invited to attend the ceremony when South Sudan became independent. I could not, for family reasons, accept the invitation. But I was connected, vitally connected with people there, whom I had known before, some of whom I had known before, whom I admired and loved, and had the highest hopes that South Sudan would be one of those success stories, and we had also hoped Eritrea would be one of those success stories. Again, we are doubly disappointed, double jeopardy. And the result, of course, is the war, as we know today. Which brings me to ask the question, or to make the point that writing the constitution, even the best constitution, is not going to be enough to create a system of government, democratic government, under which the people will have control of their governments. We have to do something. I don't know exactly what that something is, but it probably involves going beyond the formality of making a constitution, but involving the people, particularly women, who are the most to suffer in this kind of situations, involving women and all members of society in being part of a process under which they will become the deciders of their life. And in this, the international community, governments like that of the United States, the organization of the European Union, of course, our own continental body, the African Union, above all, should be involved, vitally involved in detail in the making it possible, in the process of making it possible to make the people masters of their destiny. Unless we can do that, then it's not enough simply to have a constitution, a peaceful constitution. So my plea to us, all of us, is to think in terms of enabling people, empowering people, creating the right environment under which the military especially will be under the control of people, and the government under the control of its people, so that people will not just order their military to go and shoot people. It's a Herculean task. It's a very difficult task, but it's something on which we have to make decisions because one death is too many, one too many. But deaths of thousands in horrible ways, the slaughter of people that's going on in South Sudan. And in East Congo. We should not forget the Congo. That's where it started, actually. That's where it started. And Darfur, when Sudan, before even the breakup of Sudan, had actually committed genocide. And the ICC, the International Criminal Court, had actually declared the leader of Sudan, President, what was his name? Bashir, a genocidaire, genocide. And I've given a few lectures on this point in terms of international law. And the application of international law in terms of sanctioning Sudan was blocked by China and Russia. China has oil interests in Sudan. And oil, like other resources, has now become a source of curse. We now know in political science this term of the curse of resources. The curse, instead of becoming the benefit or the cure or the blessing, it has become the curse. And oil has become the curse of South Sudan. And the mineral wealth of East Congo, the Kivu and Goma provinces of East Congo have also become a curse of the people of Congo. I have been reading a novel, which I'm not getting any money for it, but I'm just going to recommend it to everybody. This famous British writer, John le Carré, has written a book called The Mission Song. Anybody read it? The Mission Song is on the story of Eastern Congo, of how the fat cats, as the book calls them, in Kinshasa, are involved in a conspiracy with outside interests to rob the people of East Congo of their wealth and also to subject them to incredible cruelty. It's a very interesting book. I just bought it because I like John le Carré's books. But this one is of special interest to me because it's about incredible story of how he imagined a syndicate composed of Europeans representing the international community trying to save the Congo. It's new, fairly new, and there are passages which are of great interest to me, in which this syndicate in the story says this. One of the characters, that's okay. My life has been a story of constant interruptions. That's okay. One of the characters, a very attractive character, who's an elder of Eastern Congo, who is approached, and other characters, by this syndicate, European syndicate, representing the goodwill of humanity, trying to save Eastern Congo. And this man tells the people assembled, "Gentlemen, it is very well known what I want. Peace, prosperity, and inclusiveness for all Kivu." Kivu is the province of Eastern Congo. Free elections, but only when stability is established. But peace, gentlemen, is also well known, does not come of its own accord, and neither does freedom. Peace has enemies. Peace must be won by the sword. For peace to be a reality, we must coordinate our forces, repossess our mines and cities, drive out the foreigners, and still install an interim government of all Kivu that will lay down the foundation of a true, enduring, democratic welfare state. But how can we do for ourselves, gentlemen? How can we do that for ourselves, gentlemen? We are crippled by discord. Our neighbors are more powerful than we are, and more cunning. Neighbors in this case being, of course, Rwanda and Uganda. particularly Rwanda in this particular case. For our cause to prevail, we need your organization. So there's the syndicates who come from Europe. Gentlemen, we need your equipment and your expertise. Without them, the peace of my beloved Kivu will forever be an illusion. That's what I say to the non-namers. They call the syndicate no names, because they didn't give their names. Those who were my orders. And then he says, this syndicate is called Nothing. It is Nothing Incorporated. No name means no flag. No name will help to make us rich and united, but it will not own us or our people. With no name, Kivu will, for the first time, own itself. And when that day dawns, we shall go to the fat cats of Kinshasa, and we shall say to them, good morning, fat cats. How are you today? You have all got hangovers as usual, I suppose. Well, fat cats, we have some good news for you. Kivu has freed itself from foreign invaders and exploiters. The good citizens of Bukavu and Goma have risen up against the oppressor and received us with open arms. The surrogate armies of Rwanda have fled, and the genocidaire with them. Kivu has taken back its mind and put them into public ownership. That's the end. I think Milton had proposed something in the piece that he referred to, which I read today. Perhaps during question time, we should elaborate on that also. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bereket. I think the rest of the time we'll be using it for questions and answers. But if we get to that, I just want to throw a question to both of you. There are those who have been following events in the Sudan, political pundits and analysts and so on, and journalists, who say that South Sudan was rushed into independence without really resolving some of the issues that were there, that were left at the time of independence. And some people are calling for some kind of trusteeship. Perhaps if either one of you can address this issue, and you're thinking about that.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, brother. The issue of trusteeship, I think that's a definite non-starter in the 21st century. And, Africa has a very bad memory when it comes to not only colonialism, but trusteeship as well. What later became Southwest Africa was supposed to be a trustee. And it literally became a colony of South Africa and had to fight for its independence. And then it became Namibia. And just the association of the word trusteeship with the colonial era, I don't think that's something that the Africans in general or people in South Sudan would find something that they could tolerate or swallow. But that does not mean that there's no need for serious intervention in South Sudan. And that is why I actually proposed in my op-ed in the Daily News the neutral, independent, outside armed force to take care of security. So in a way, it would be exercising almost the powers of trusteeship without the connotation of being a trustee. Because I think if the people of South Sudan sacrificed and fought for almost 50 years to free themselves from domination from Khartoum, I don't see that they would accept being a trustee of any other entity. But I think, as of today, both Salva Kiir, particularly Salva Kiir, since he's still the one being identified as pursuing the military aggression, as well as Riek Machar, I think they've lost the argument of being the guarantors of peace and security for the people of South Sudan. I don't see why they would object if they were told that they can remain as political players. They can, in fact, recompose the transitional government of national unity, maybe for a fixed period leading toward elections, whether it's 5 years or 6 years' time, and have other political players involved as well. Riek Machar and Salva Kiir are not the only aspirants for political leadership in South Sudan, but during that period, none of them should exercise control over armed forces, given the history of how the armed forces have conducted themselves since South Sudan became independent. So you're not denying them political participation. In fact, you're saying, now both of you will be able to make your case in the political arena without worrying that the other side is trying to kill you. Your safety and the safety of the rest of the citizens of South Sudan is now assured by an international neutral force while you maintain your political aspirations. And that's why I made that proposal. I think that proposal is possibly much more acceptable to both Salva Kiir and Riek Machar than imposing a trustee forcefully. I think they might actually be willing to accept it. I see the bigger problem being Uganda. I don't think Museveni would be interested in that. He would no longer be a player in South Sudan, and that is something he would not want to lose. Let me add one other point on how diabolically clever this Ugandan dictator is. Now you have about 800 to 900,000 refugees from South Sudan being hosted in Uganda, which is very good. Ugandans are generally very open anyway and have always hosted refugees, whether from the Congo and whether from when South Sudan was still Southern Sudan, when they were fighting against Khartoum for 50 years. So Uganda has always hosted refugees anyway. Never to this size and extent. But now what is Museveni doing? He's trying to milk political and diplomatic capital out of this. So even though he was the primary arsonist, because when Uganda intervened in 2013 to support Salva Kiir, it was quite ruthless. Uganda's army used cluster bombs, which is banned internationally. And this was reported by Human Rights Watch, which asked for an investigation. And no investigation was done because, as I said earlier, the United States has provided diplomatic cover for Uganda all these years. So anyway, now you have the arsonist who exacerbated the crises in South Sudan wanting to be a diplomatic player now. So he has proposed, and the United Nations has agreed to co-host a refugee solidarity conference in Uganda, co-hosted by dictator Museveni, and one of the guests is going to be the Secretary General of the United Nations. The same United Nations who discussed a report in April implicating Uganda in these atrocities. Now you're going to have the diplomatic image of the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, standing on some podium with the arsonist in Uganda and talking about the good work that Museveni is doing by hosting the refugees from South Sudan, when he in fact is the one that lit the fire. And that is why one of the steps I've taken today, I created a petition on change.org, and I invite everyone who's here today who wants to do something to go to that petition. It is addressed, Guterres, don't let Museveni use UN to politicize suffering of South Sudan refugees. I hope you read that petition. If you agree with it, I hope you do sign it as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll just add a word which is more technical. I think Milton's answer has given the substantive answer. But I would like to emphasize the importance of the African Union. As the continental body, the African Union should actually shoulder the responsibility for helping resolve disputes. After all, it has become a better institution than the OAU in the writing of its constitution. I had a small part as a member of the commission that wrote the OAU Charter. And in a matter on which the African Union is better than the OAU is its structure. It now has a structure of a commission led by one chairman, commissioner, chairperson, and the deputy chairperson, and then 8 commissions, one of which is political commission, the other is commission on peace and security. These two, and particularly the second one, should shoulder the responsibility technically and practically and creatively to create modalities under which future abuse of power, future genocidal actions will be avoided. The late Professor Ali Mazrui, my colleague and friend, once wrote a wonderful piece under which he said, one reason why there are oppressions in Africa when there are no equally divided small nations. And Tanzania is the prime example of that. Where you have one dominant ethnic group or 2 ethnic groups, then the chances for oppression are there. I think it's a wonderful insight. And therefore, one of the things I think that had to be done in terms of creating the modalities of avoiding and resolving current problems is to emphasize the importance of the small nations, small ethnic groups, and in the structure to make them participants in making decisions. In other words, reduce more the power of the dominant groups like the Dinka and the Nuer, and enable the others. Scores of them have more or less equal power in this. I think that can be done. Something which we miss, I think, in the making of the Constitution. But then we must learn from our mistakes. Thank you.
Earlier you mentioned the role of women. You know, we all know that the primary victims of these atrocities are women. And also in the peacemaking, women have played significant roles, such as in Liberia. That's how they ended the war there. And can you elaborate a little more about the role of women in this situation?
I don't think it needs elaboration. It's a cardinal fact of life. Women are not only half of the population, but they are the most important in this respect because they bear the consequences of such tragedies. And because of this, they instinctively feel that peace is more important than war. Peace is the way to go in terms of resolving disputes. And I think if women are empowered, specifically given power, and supported by institutions, by international community and national bodies, they will be able to play a part in terms of resolving disputes, as they did in Tanzania at one time, in Zanzibar. Yeah, I have a piece which I think Dr. Mohammed has a copy of, in which I mentioned the role of women, and that was mentioned in conferences in Africa. We don't say enough, I think, about the importance of women in terms not only of taking part in practical things in their own life, at home and in the society, but also in terms of actively participating in the resolution of conflicts, and also in helping avoid the occurrence of conflicts. Thank you.
I think we'll now open the podium to questions. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, guys, for coming here today to discuss the crisis in South Sudan. So my name is Harun. I am from Sudan, and I really enjoyed the discussion and the presentation by Milton and Bereket for today. Just I have a question for both of you. If you know the situation in South Sudan is more ethnic issues, there is a more ethnic problem a long time ago between Dinka and Nuer, and that's why it driven, the crisis became so heavily like this since 2013. So what is your suggestion for the problem? Because the problem is not really between Salva Kiir and Machar, between the Dinka tribe and the Nuer tribe, because there is unwritten agreement. There is some rumors like this unwritten agreement between Dinka and Nuer that the President Salva Kiir will be the president for the first term, and then the next term will be Machar. And this, when it came to Machar preparing for the elections, President Salva Kiir refused, to step down, and then Machar became the president. So that's the source of the problem. That's some analysts, they say like this. So what is your suggestion about Dinka and Nuer? Because it's really it's a big problem. I have another question about like right now we are activists here from Africa, from different places. What is your best solution for us? How we can contribute to solve the situation in South Sudan? Should we support like charity, international, Red Cross, whatever it's IRC, different NGOs operating in South Sudan, or should we make more pressure on U.S. government to stop supporting the President Salva Kiir or maybe President Museveni? So what's your suggestion on that? Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. In terms of the second half of your question, I think the answer is actually implicit in the question itself. I think if there's a reputable organization involved in relief work, yes, obviously, we should support them. I think the other thing that we could all do is organize events like this and have knowledgeable speakers involved so that we can get as many people as possible engaged in the effort. In terms of saying the problems between Dinka and Nuer go way back, I don't support that notion, because if we say that, that can apply to every African country, right? That can apply to Uganda, it can apply to Nigeria. I mean, we saw how Nigeria was almost torn apart by the Civil War, right? When Biafra tried to secede. So I don't think that is a fair way to analyze it. I think Even in Rwanda, when we saw the genocidal killings between Hutu and Tutsi, it was when political players started to incite violence, right? Appealing to the base sentiments and abusing ethnic differences. And politicians tend to do this, by the way, everywhere, not only in Africa, as you know. We saw that in the political election here last year, right? So I'm saying, I think no politician should be allowed to exploit and abuse ethnicity and to cause the kind of calamity we've seen, not only in South Sudan, but in many African countries. So obviously today, I think Salva Kiir thinks he has a military advantage over Riek Machar, and therefore he has no incentive to negotiate in good faith. I think, and I commend what the African Union actually did in terms of the African Union and IGAD to force them to come to the negotiating table and came up with this agreement in 2015, in August 2015. It took a lot of hard work. But at the same time, it turns out that Museveni, who was supposed to be a neutral mediator, was assuring Salva Kiir that if you abrogate this agreement, I will give you the military cover. And that's why that agreement didn't work. I think it's clear there's no military solution. We should find a way to force these parties back to negotiate in good faith and neutralize all the negative armed forces in South Sudan. Thank you.
Any questions?
Where should I be? Okay. I think it's working. Oh, okay. As I recall, Secretary of State Clinton was instrumental in getting South Sudan an exemption from the ban on child soldiers. Can you talk about the role of child soldiers there now? And also, is AFRICOM playing any role, direct or indirect? Thank you.
Well, in terms of AFRICOM, I think you're actually asking what is the U.S. role. As you know, many African countries were not willing to base AFRICOM, and they actually all refused. And when Liberia was willing, all African countries asked, put pressure on Liberia. So there's been a general belief that in the absence of AFRICOM, the U.S. has found willing, quote-unquote, partners that it can accomplish the same objective that could have been accomplished by AFRICOM. And Uganda is believed to be one of those countries. The U.S. has a very strong military presence in Uganda, as I said, as bases in Entebbe, and that base is being expanded. And obviously it's worked closely with Uganda in Somalia, it's worked closely with Uganda in Central African Republic, supposedly searching for Joseph Kony, which again, once again, General Museveni, diabolically clever, used that to basically get US resources. Kony was never the leader of the Lord's Resistance Army. It was never been a real military threat to Museveni. Uganda's army, how strong is Uganda's army? Uganda's army was able to invade Rwanda in 1990 and cause regime change there. And that's what led to the massacres in 1994. Uganda's army was able to invade what was then Zaire, together with Rwanda, and cause regime change there. So nobody in Uganda has ever believed that Joseph Kony was a real threat to Museveni. And yet, Museveni convinced the US to become involved in this search for Joseph Kony, went all the way to Central African Republic. Only recently has the New York Times now started reporting that while in the Central African Republic, Uganda was not actually searching for Joseph Kony. The soldiers were committing rapes against young women, and the Washington Post had earlier reported that the military of Uganda had been engaged in smuggling diamonds from South Sudan. And yet the US still has this close military relationship with Uganda. I submit quite sincerely that if Museveni is being able, if we can get Museveni reined in, I think we would see significant change in terms of some of these conflicts tapering down. I think I forgot the first part of your question. Child soldiers have been widely used in South Sudan, in Uganda, in Eastern Congo, in Central African Republic, because we can imagine in situations where you have economic collapse, you have a lot of young, particularly young boys, very impressionable, and and the leaders of these insurgencies abuse those situations.
Comment?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It was quite informative. I just want clarity. I know Dr. Nurhussein asked a question earlier. If the independence of South Sudan was premature, and I don't think that was addressed, but probably I missed that, because and if it was, what was not in place to prepare for the independence of South Sudan that actually led to where we are today? Thank you, sir.
The right of the Southern Sudanese people for self-determination after a long war, a murderous war under which a few 100,000 people died, not only because of the war, but because of starvation. That right was something which has been universally recognized. The people had the right, in theory and in practice, to determine their fate, particularly at a time when they had been subjected to horrendous acts of, by members of the Northern Sudanese Party, members of the United States Christian community actually appealed to President Bush that our fellow Christians have been victimized, they have been enslaved, there were cases of people who had been raped and people had been enslaved, and convinced President George W. Bush to help broker the final solution of the meeting between the leaders of Sudan and the SPLA, which finally, of course, led to Sudan's separation, South Sudan's separation. And therefore, when we talk about the right of people to self-determination, we are talking about a very fundamental, very important human rights of people. Nobody doubts that. Whether it was hurried, whether it was done too quickly, I don't know. I don't think so personally. I think the matter had been discussed and debated again and again by the African Union, but before it by the OAU and by the United Nations and the European Union. And the right of the people of South Sudan had been recognized to the extent that everybody, I think, in the European Union and individual governments supported the separation of the South. The intervention of the United States was, of course, based not only on religious grounds, but on strategic grounds, because continual fight between the Southern People, Sudan Liberation Front, and North Sudan would create instability, which would not be in the interest of American strategic and geopolitical interests. And therefore, everybody was of one mind in terms of getting the people of South Sudan obtain their freedom. And of course, the process of the making of the constitution, which took some 3 years, was part of it, of the preparation of the people of South to take over government from the North and become a new nation for themselves. Where things went wrong, I think both of us have said enough about why things went wrong. It had nothing to do with the untimeliness of the granting of independence to South Sudan.
Hi, thank you, both the speakers, for coming. I have a question about what is happening in the south of the country, Sudan, the insurgencies and the violence that's taking place there, and how that affects what is going on in South Sudan, how they interrelate.
Could you elaborate?
Well, my understanding is that there is conflict going on and insurgencies against the government of Sudan, and the Sudan government is attacking people who live in villages and areas in the south of South Sudan. I'm just curious how that affects the problems that we have in the country of South Sudan, and if it has an impact.
Milton, use the podium mic. There's the mic for it.
All right, thanks for the question. I think, actually, since the comprehensive peace agreement that led to the independence of South Sudan, the conflict between the South and the North essentially ended. So now much of the fighting is being conducted coming from where the South Sudan government is headquartered in Juba, which is, yes, the southern part of South Sudan, and pushing north towards the northern part of what is now the country of South Sudan. And at least according to the many media reports, particularly since January, and according to the report by what they call the panel of experts that prepared the report for the Security Council, much of the fighting is now being directed by Salva Kiir against the people that he perceived to be the supporters of Riek Machar. Before last July, between 2013, when the first government of unity collapsed and Riek Machar was forced into exile, between 2013 to 2015, both sides were engaged in a full-fledged civil war, and both sides were engaged in atrocities. But as of July 2016, at least according to the report submitted to the UN Security Council by the UN group of experts and by most media accounts, the killings are actually being conducted now by soldiers under the command of President Salva Kiir, and until recently, his chief of military staff, whose name was Paul Malong. Now, the UN report mentioned both Salva Kiir by name and Paul Malong as being responsible for most of his atrocities. So when the report came out, I was not shocked that a few weeks later, Salva Kiir fired Paul Malong. I think he's trying to create a firewall between himself and accountability for the atrocities. But the report actually mentioned not only Paul Malong, but mentioned Salva Kiir as well. as being directly responsible for the atrocities that are going on today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent presentation. Thank you very much. I have learned a great deal from the presentation, and I have a better understanding of the involvement of the Ugandan government in South Sudan, and also I have a better understanding of the involvement of the United States in South Sudan. The question I have is the involvement of China in South Sudan. How deeply is it involved in that conflict? Thank you.
I am not a China expert, but I have a colleague in the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who's been writing a book on China, and I've got fragments of knowledge about the involvement of China through this colleague of mine. I've also been, of course, generally interested in China's role in Africa in general, an increasing role in terms of economic development, investment, trade, and so on. In many parts of Africa, China has actually replaced European countries and even the United States, and in Southern Africa in particular, including South Africa, Mozambique, Angola, even Eastern Africa, Kenya and Uganda. Some of its involvement is positive, but it's creating some pressures on the part of African small businesses and even individuals. So there have been some problems of Africans attacking Chinese in the marketplace. So this is a sign of problems, of things to come, of problems coming. Basically, I think the problem is not just China's involvement, but the method and manner of China's involvement and the means China uses to influence policy, to influence leaders, and leading to corruption. All leaders are asked is to sign on the dotted lines, and they will be beneficiaries in terms of billions of dollars worth of benefits. So, which raises the question of democracy. How do people control their governments? How do people ensure that they will be the beneficiaries of development coming out of China's involvement in trade and development and investment? And that means really democracy, the right of the people to control their governments, and through that control, of course, to avoid corruption, which is an issue involving the entire continent of Africa. Corruption. I know people in Angola who, during the struggle, as members of the MPLA, had nothing. And their members of their family are now billionaires. The daughter of the president of Angola is now a billionaire in her own right. And this is a pattern throughout Africa. And China has become an enabler in this phenomenon. So that's all I can say. In terms of South Sudan, or Sudan in general, all I know is, I think I made a mention of this before, that the Chinese and the Russians have been the obstacle in terms of sanctioning the government of Sudan, particularly the president, when he was declared the genocide, committed genocide. And therefore the Chinese have been an obstacle, whether they've been taking active part in the particular war in the southern Sudan. I don't know. Maybe Milton can add to that.
Yes, China's interest is obviously on resources as well, particularly oil. So the China National Petroleum was a big player. I think China was one of the major importers of oil from South Sudan. But as you know, because of the conflict, some of the facilities, I believe, were destroyed, and the oil export had peaked, I think, at 300,000 barrels per day. I think it's collapsed to just over 100,000 barrels per day. And a few months ago, some Chinese technicians who were working in the refineries in South Sudan had been kidnapped. And I read an article where apparently Riek Machar played a role in securing their release. So I don't think there are many Chinese technicians, at least as of today, involved in South Sudan, just because of the fighting has disrupted the oil production.
Thank you. Can you hold it there, Milton? I just want to go back to an earlier, your proposed solution for South Sudan, essentially which required disarming the two major combatants. But I think it's not a matter of only the two. I think I have read somewhere there are as many as 700 generals,
Right.
probably the country with the most generals anyway.
Yes.
And each general has his own, followers in the army. Salva Kiir or Machar brings them to the fold, but they retain sort of within that. It's really a sort of hodgepodge of
Right. Yes, I think.
while Salva Kiir may want to agree on one, with whatever AU, for example, suggests, some renegade general might just have another one, and that's been the case. So how do you figure, I would imagine, as Dr. Bereket said, perhaps maybe the role for African Union Commission for Peace and Security to grab this by the horn, but what enforcement mechanism would we have to bring this to bear?
Right, I'm glad you asked that question actually, because remember in Eastern Congo, when M23, a so-called rebel army, which was actually trained and financed by Rwanda and Uganda, was causing a lot of havoc, committing atrocities, a decision was made to disarm M23. And African armies were recruited that were seen to be relatively neutral, not certainly from Uganda, not certainly from Rwanda. They were from Tanzania and South Africa and Malawi. And they were given the green light to disarm M23 by any means necessary, and they disarmed M23 within a matter of weeks and created a more peaceful environment. So it can certainly be done if there is a meeting of the mind. In terms of the proliferation of generals, I think you have a proliferation of generals because, primarily for two reasons. Salva Kiir is trying to buy their allegiance. So if they're a general in his army drawing a salary, there's no need for them to be fighting him. So I think it's just a proliferation as a source of income. If the alternative sources of income, I think they probably could choose a different profession, be engaged in a different profession if they have other skills. If they don't have other skills, South Sudan is a relatively wealthy country. If peace could be restored, if investments can start coming in, I'm sure these are people who would be candidates to lead enterprises in a peaceful South Sudan. I look back at Liberia, I look back at Sierra Leone, at the height of the conflict in those countries. At one time, people believed we could never have peace in these countries. But there was a meeting of the mind, there were major players involved, the international community, the African Union. Now today, compared to about a decade ago, Sierra Leone and Liberia have turned around dramatically, unbelievable. Remember when we had daily news, television images of the most brutal killings being committed by children? in Liberia and Sierra Leone, those images are gone today. Many of those kids eventually were rehabilitated, some were trained in crafts, some managed to go back to school. So I think this can also be done for South Sudan, so long as there's a meeting of the minds.
So I have felt very interested in what you've all said, but also feel a real deficit of historical knowledge. So one of the questions or set of questions I have is, number one, was Sudan and South Sudan, what was the colonial relationship that they had? Number two, what is the language? Is there a difference in language between South Sudanese and Sudan itself? Those whole set of questions. Thirdly, what is the OAU that you have referred to? Pardon?
It's called the African Union now.
Okay, well that's what I was curious. What is the history of that relationship, the OAU and the African Union? Do they both still exist as separate entities? And finally, the question of if in fact, and you may have to some degree just answered this, there was a peacekeeping force that was brought there, where would that force come from? Who would staff it? Other African countries? How would that be? And then, how would it be financed? From what entities around the world would it be financed? And how does one deal with that set of questions? So a little bit of the history, and also a little bit of how one would deal with this present idea of a force for peace.
Let me see if I can answer some of the questions. The OAU is Organization of African Unity that was established in 1963 when African countries were becoming independent and there was a desire for unity at that time. So this was the organization. But it became a club of dictators eventually, I mean, with not much of really activity until it was reorganized and in 2000, I guess, as African Union, with, as Dr. Bereket alluded to, with really better structure and set of principles about human rights and good governance and so on. So that's what the AU now is, and it has several divisions. On the question of the history, this didn't start in 2005. The history, Sudan, both south and north, was occupied in 1820 by the king of Egypt, Muhammad Ali dynasty, who was part of the Ottoman Empire at the time. But this is the entire landmass, because the tribes in the north and the south, they were just conquered, and the Egyptian, Muhammad Ali's forces occupied it all the way down to the Great Lakes.
And was there any European?
It was one landmass, okay. But the Northerners were using the South for slave trade. Most of the Northerners being mostly, although not quite Arab, they are Islamized Sudanese, and there was a slave trade, thriving slave trade going on, among other things. But Egypt itself was becoming, in the turn of the 19th century, of the 20th century, because of the construction of the Suez Canal, the country was really bankrupt and had to borrow to survive, from Britain. Britain was willing to lend it, but in exchange for really hegemony over that area. In fact, Egypt became practically sort of nominally independent but a protectorate. And the British, made an arrangement with the Egyptians to make the Sudan, because they really coveted the Sudan now north and south, one big, to just called it Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. Egypt was a junior partner, but really it itself had no say much. It was really Britain. So that's part of the story. And when Sudan became independent, because of the negligence both by the British colonial administration and subsequent independent Sudan, because of the negligence of the South, the uprising started in 1955. So that was the first uprising. Then that ended with the 1972 peace agreement. That was signed in Addis Ababa through the good office of Selassie. At that time, the Sudanese president was a general who came by way of a coup, supported by the Communist Party of Sudan at the time, and was able to reach an agreement with the South that would give autonomy to the South and also put more money to develop the South. That was, in fact, the vice president was Southern Sudanese, the federal of the whole country. And it was not until the abrogation of that agreement by the Sudanese government that the second uprising started in 1983, late in 1980s, early 80s. So that's really the background. Language when it was one under the Sudanese government was Arabic, and but Arabic English is of course in the South English was preferred. By the way, the British actually had plans to take South Sudan out of Sudan and put it part of their East African colonial empire in that area. And the French had their designs on that to take it to part of their West Africa. So there was a lot of goings on at the time. Anyway, but I guess, do you want to address that? Yes. That would be better. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to.
I must say, when medical doctors become historians, it's a wonderful thing to behold. And when the doctor turned historian happens to be a friend of mine, it's a double pleasure. He gave you a wonderful narrative, summary of the history, but let me add a couple of points. And one of them is related to your question about languages and ethnicity. First of all, to add to what he just said, the southern part of Sudan was neglected by the British. Neglected in terms of economic development, education, infrastructure, and therefore there was a long-standing resentment by the South against the central government, which was favored by the British. And during the Anglo-Egyptian condominium, it was called, the Egyptians used, the British used the Egyptians as the junior partners of the condominium because they knew the language. They knew the language and the culture of Sudan. So therefore, it's a very interesting collaboration between the British and the Egyptians. But then things went wrong because the Egyptians themselves became interested in becoming independent, but not to control Sudan. And in terms of modern geopolitical issues, the issue of Southern Sudan separating itself from Sudan was unacceptable to the Americans because it was unacceptable to the Egyptians. Egypt is an important partner in the American strategic interest of the area. And therefore, willy-nilly, the Americans were in favor of the policy and strategy of the Egyptians. One reason why they denied the right for the southern people to self-determination. That became an imperative because the people themselves of Southern Sudan, through military and armed struggle, achieved a prominence and a position under which they could not no longer be denied. one of their complaints was that they never built schools in our area, never built infrastructure. You favored the southern, the Arabic-speaking, predominantly Muslim South. We are more predominantly Christian. The fathers were predominantly Christian, although there were some Muslims. Very few of them spoke Arabic. That was also one of the points of contention during the North-South relation. Now, the ethnic question, I think we answered it. The southern part of Sudan has, I don't know how many, but over 50 different ethnic groups with different languages. The Nuer speak a different language from the Dinka, the two major ethnic groups, and there are others who have their own language, their own culture. That's why I thought that in terms of creating equality, a sense of equality and democracy, the minority ethnic group must be empowered. And there must be a structure, constitutional structure, under which they are not only empowered theoretically, but also in terms of reality. That, I think, is going to be the most important part of the equation in the future. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
I just wanted to get to the aspect of the peacekeeping force, and I'm glad you actually asked that question, because I might have neglected to bring this issue up. As we speak today, there are 17,000 UN peacekeeping troops in South Sudan. So the obvious question is, what are they doing, right? Nothing. They're not authorized to intervene even when they see atrocities. And this is the saddest part that we might not have touched upon tonight had you not brought this question. There are some horrific stories that you can read. I think the Wall Street Journal did a few articles, more so than even the New York Times, about UN peacekeeping troops witnessing soldiers loyal to Salva Kiir raping women right in front of them and not intervening. This is what was going on in South Sudan. 17,000 peacekeeping troops not doing anything. At a cost of, I'm looking at the budget for 2016-2017, $1,081 million. That is the budget. If these kind of funds could be used to finance a true peacekeeping force, it can be done. The same, perhaps the same armed forces from Tanzania, South Africa, and Malawi that helped restore relative peace in Eastern Congo. So that would be my answer. In terms of the financing is there, but obviously they're not doing anything with the troops that they have in the country already.
Thank you, Milton. We are winding down. I think the question that was asked with the flyer, in the flyer was, what can we do as a peace organization, or what can we do as a diaspora organization? I think, how can we exert pressure on our government? I think it was touched on earlier. I will first take this question, and then I'll ask Siddiq to answer the second question, what the diaspora organization can do in terms of bringing peace to this.
I would like to, I think this woman back here, when she was asking about the situation in southern Sudan, I don't think that either maybe you didn't understand what she was asking about. I believe what she was asking about is the conflict in the regions just above the border, South Kordofan and the Nuba Mountains, and the other oil-rich region right above, perhaps two areas that should be part of South Sudan and got stuck in the north. The weaponry that's going on, the fighting that's going on, the refugees that are coming from those areas into South Sudan, and the addition they're causing to the famine and disease in South Sudan. I believe that's what she was asking about, if you could talk about that.
Actually, to be honest with you, I'm not that familiar with it.
Okay.
I think we actually provided a better summary.
Okay. Okay.
Actually, I had understood the question to be exactly what it was. But then, of course, Milton did a wonderful job in explaining the problem, the crisis within Southern Sudan itself, which is another, I think, crisis point. The people in what are called the Nuba Mountains are northwest of South Sudan and southeast of Sudan itself. That is part of Sudan, not Northern Sudan. They have been people who always complain about being neglected. It's a simple case of being neglected by the central government, run from Khartoum. Many of them have gone to school and therefore spoke Arabic and so on, but they have their own language, the Nuba Mountains people. Then there, of course, the famous case of the Darfuris, Darfur region, a region under which there have been genocides committed by the Khartoum government, still unresolved, still there. Hundreds of thousands of them had to leave, depart from their own homeland and live in neighboring Chad. Some of them have come back, but many still are still there. So we have there a still unresolved crisis in the Sudan. The Darfur region still a region of conflict. The conflict in Southern Sudan has existed from, in terms of a question of current significance. It is still there. It's still there. So what can I say? I mean, Africa once more has become a continent of crisis, of people. The horrendous nature of the killing in South Sudan and in Congo, let's not forget Eastern Congo, is still part, is still a neglected issue at the international level. I insist that charity begins at home. We have to begin from the African Union. The African Union. The African Union came into being in 2001 when the OAU decided to change itself. And it has improved in terms of structure, but in terms of effectiveness, it's still weak. And it depends on each member government of the African nations to make the African Union more potent, more important, more involved in resolving problems of its continent. That demands goodwill, and strong commitment by leaders. So we need to search our hearts as members of the African continent, as Africanists, as Africans, and force our governments to take care of their problems using the available structure. And the only structure we have is, just as internationally, the only thing we've got is the United Nations, and therefore we must ignore its weaknesses and deal with it. We have the same thing in Africa. The only thing we've got is the African Union. We must use it. Particularly the coming generation. You're younger than me, Milton, your generation. And those like Elias and Bereket in your generation have to take over the burden from us and insist on organizing. Organizing petitions is good, it's very important, but I think organizing, particularly in Africa itself, because I teach young Africans. I also go to Africa and give lectures and see young Africans interested, passionately interested in creating a sense of potency among themselves as Africans. We have to build on that. We have to build on that. We have no alternative. It's important to have that, and then the European Union, the Americans, and individual governments like those of the United States, and Germany, and China, of course. China must be brought to become a factor of positive action. We can, of course, dispute some of the policies of China, but we must not neglect China. It's an emerging hegemonic power. We cannot afford to ignore it. Thank you.
All right. Again, to close, then, thank you, Dr. Bereket. I think that was wonderful. I think it's a call for the... you want to add to that? Okay.
I'm actually glad that you brought that up in terms of African agency, because, you know, hopefully we have not conveyed the impression that there are not many people on the ground in the continent agitating often at the risk of their lives for change. And the youth in particular, yes, of course, we saw what happened in Burkina Faso when they drove Compaoré, the dictator who had killed the popular Thomas Sankara and then ruled for 27 years, tried to get the constitution changed so he could perpetuate his regime. And the young people just came out to the streets and forced him into exile. And then they were supposed to hold elections a year later, and one of the loyalist generals tried to prevent that from happening by trying to take over. That general was driven out as well. So the youth are, in fact, in many situations, trying to take control of their destiny. In Democratic Republic of the Congo, even with the atrocious conditions, the young people are really pushing, and they're using social media and emulating some of the techniques that young people use in this country in terms of mobilizing through social media. So I'm glad you brought that aspect up.
Thank you. I think the time is come. Just one more before. The United African Congress is one of those sponsors, and I would ask the President of the United African Congress to just say a word and answer the question of what the diaspora African community is doing about this, Okay, let's go.
First of all, let me thank the Brooklyn for Peace organization for and of course, Dr. Bereket was right when you have a medical doctor turned historian. It's really commendable. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Milton. My role is very simple here as National President of the United African Congress. I think we have worked with supported Brooklyn for Peace initiatives, and we will continue to do that. I want to go to just give some examples, and then you could see that what is happening in the Sudan has happened in other parts of the world. But the difference is the people that make decisions, United States, the P5s that they call them, have not really taken this matter. And the reason for that is, despite the fact that Africa is almost going to be 1 billion people, not a single African sits on the Security Council. That is a problem. So civil society should really begin asking the question, how do we participate, like Dr. Bereket said very effectively, how do we participate in things that affect our own destinies? Is the issue of taxation without representation. If we are not at the table, we don't count. In the United States, with the Trumpism that you all know now, they're talking about slashing the State Department budget, slashing peacekeeping operations. But there's a good news. The good news is civil society can change that. That's how the Vietnam War became a very serious engagement in this country. When people rose up and started building coalitions to others, things do happen. And I'm not predicting that we're going to have a presidential impeachment, but hopefully we need to have a real president that has cares about what happens around the world, that this isolationism cannot work anymore. This is a global failure. How do we look at, let me give you 3 examples to show the power of the diaspora. South Africa, apartheid. We don't have apartheid anymore. Ebola, when almost 1,000 people died before the UN began to pay attention. And do you know how it happened? We came together. The diaspora came together and started asking questions. We held the first forum at the UN to tell them that they are not doing what they're supposed to do. When civil society got up, there was money put into these countries, and today we say, thank God, Ebola is something of the past, but they're talking about it now also in the Congo. Recently, very recently, and maybe you should know, there has been a big contest that took 2 years to electing the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros from Ethiopia. There has been no African ever in the history of the world to be elected to that position. After almost 2 years, bringing it almost close to about 2 weeks to the event, we had a meeting and they said the diaspora got involved. Well, guess what? Dr. Tedros, for the first time in the history of the World Health Organization, is the Director General of the World Health Organization. Dr. Bereket, a lot of the diaspora put their resources together, led by, of course, the distinguished chairman, and Milton Allimadi and Dr. Bereket, Dr. Tedros now. We're not taking total credit, but I think we did something to raise the consciousness, the level of consciousness, to saying that we can make something. And African leaders came together to lobby the world, and that's how that victory was won. United States, I can end. You have City Council, State Assembly, State Senate, the House of Representatives, the Senate of the United States, and of course the White House. There isn't a single African from the continent elected to any of these positions. That is taxation without representation. So we appeal to civil society. We are now all of the same, in the same village. We need to work together to not looking at people for where they came from, but the contribution that they could make to human society. I thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, I think it's time. In fact, we have overstayed our welcome. And here is Dr. Charlotte Phillips, the chairperson of the Brooklyn for Peace.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody who spoke. It was really a fabulous presentation, and we can organize another event very soon, I hope, and have you come back again, because we've only begun to scratch the surface. I wanted to mention that our next upcoming event is on Saturday, June 17th. A week from this Saturday will be the Women's March to Ban the Bomb. This is because at the UN, 123 nations have voted to negotiate a treaty that will make nuclear weapons illegal. The US has boycotted the negotiations. We need to be out there to let them know this is like really outrageous and that this has to be done as soon as possible, and to show them with our being out in the street that we want this to happen. We want the US to participate, but even if it doesn't, we want the treaty to be negotiated. So please take these flyers at the back and let other of your friends know, and please try to join us. We have a Brooklyn location noted on these flyers, and the other locations will be also posted online. And finally, we wanted to let you know that this is a free event, but we do have expenses to cover in making the event happen. So if you can donate on your way out, Fran is at the table there out front. We have 2 donation containers. If you donate as much as you can, we greatly appreciate it. And please sign up for our mailings if you haven't already, so we can stay in touch with you for future events. And again, thank you so very much for coming.